Good morning. Welcome back to history. Hopefully you guys had some time to read through the Abraham Lincoln assassination. The war is over and our poor president has been assassinated. A huge issue at the time was, now what do we do with the country? At what point are we at now, and how do we bring everybody back together after having been a country split into two, right? So today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction failures. So I sent a few things home with you. There's a reading that I'm going to go over here in just a moment with you. There are a few notes on the back of what the solution for Reconstruction should be. And then there are some questions for you. Now these questions won't necessarily come right from the reading and from the notes. A lot of this is opinion and reflection on what we're going to read today. Also, you will notice that I put up a short reading about a person in history that we'll mention in this reading. And I also put up a short video on Reconstruction. Now, the video, I really like crash courses. I think the guy that does the crash courses is kind of, he's funny. But he talks really fast. So there may be a point where you have to slow down a little bit and maybe pause if you're paying attention to that and want to have a better idea of what Reconstruction after the Civil War was all about. So if you're with me to read along with the materials that I have, wonderful. I'm going to start with the Reconstruction failures, okay? So after the Civil War, Congress was dominated by Republicans. As a result, they were able to pass many laws and policies that gave African Americans more rights. In the first few years of Reconstruction, former slaves exercised their right to vote, participated in sit-ins, and even held office. For example, in 1872, an African American named P.B.S. Pinchback served as the governor of Louisiana. It's got a really cool, interesting name, actually. His full name is Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and that's one of the readings that I put on, the extra stuff that I put in there, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about P.B.S. Pinchback. He's an interesting guy. And so Republicans also raised revenue to build schools, hospitals, and roads in the South. Rebuilding the South costs money, which came from raising taxes. Right? That's what we have to do, is raise the taxes in order to build things that we need in our community. So this is what happened after the North was victorious and the South needed rebuilding. As time went on and the country experienced an economic depression, Americans became disenchanted with Republican politics, and politicians lost interest in the African American cause. Okay, that word disenchanted, it basically means unhappy. So everybody's unhappy. Americans are unhappy at this point because there is, after any kind of war or any big event, our economy goes into a bit of a depression. So you can use what's happening right now. There's an obvious effect on our economy because of our crisis that we're in right now. So it's much the same with the Civil War. And there was just a lack of money. So of course, that's hard for politicians as well. And so unfortunately what happened was the African American cause was just sort of lost. Continuing on here, in 1877, a compromise took place where Democrats gave a Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in exchange for him pulling federal troops out of the South. This ended the Reconstruction era. So another little agreement was made, and now all troops have been pulled away, and we're really truly moving toward a United States again. But a group called the Redeemer Democrats took it upon themselves to restore the South to its former glory by putting, sorry, I just had a phone call and I've had to ignore it, by putting African Americans back into a subordinate position. The word subordinate means lower class or less than, and in this case, less than a white citizen. This was often done through violence, and this is where we start to hear about hate groups like the KKK, who terrorized and killed African Americans in an effort to keep them from voting and exercising their rights as citizens. Southern states passed black codes that severely limited African Americans' freedoms. So while we fought very hard to end slavery and all of these things, in the South, there's still this sort of sense of slavery where African American people were not given the same rights, and even in law, were not allowed to do certain things that they were hoping to do with Reconstruction. These codes prohibited African Americans from owning property, holding office, and even appearing in public without a white escort. So it sounds pretty much like slavery, right? Sadly, the progress made in the Reconstruction was essentially reversed in the years following. African Americans would not enjoy the rights they were guaranteed under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments until almost a century later. So these amendments that were passed, they didn't actually get to have the rights that they deserved until almost 100 years later. Doesn't seem right? Onto the back, you have Reconstruction solutions. So these were what was set out to happen. So up at the top is what was in place for former slaves, down at the bottom what was in place in order to rebuild the South. So I'll sort of read through those, take them as notes, take them as a little more guidance for you as you're answering those, what is it, 4 or 6 questions that I have on that sheet for you. So of the top former slaves, the idea was that African Americans would become citizens. And under the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and with the 14th Amendment of 1868, that was supposed to happen. Former slaves can work for pay on plantations, which obviously was not happening before. Few were given land. Under that, there's a definition. Sharecropping is a system where landowners would provide housing, tools, and seed, and laborers would work the land for a small wage. So at this point, they were able to work for probably very little, but were allowed to have these few extra things that they maybe weren't able to have, or they weren't able to have before. At this point, Black males were able to vote, and that would have been given to them in the 15th Amendment of 1870. Many primary or elementary and secondary schools were built for African Americans, so they didn't necessarily at this point we were not an inclusive country. We didn't, our white and our African American students did not attend school together, and what that means under that bullet, that word segregated means separated. So segregated schools, Blacks and whites went to separate schools. And of course, Black schools would be seen as inferior. That word inferior means less than, or less than white people. Okay, so there's some notes on the former slaves and what was happening with Reconstruction, or the idea of Reconstruction. Down at the bottom, the former rebels in the South, because the South needed to be sort of completely rebuilt at this point. So Southern leaders were not tried for treason. So like deciding to go to war against our own country, they were not tried for that. Jefferson Davis was in prison for 2 years, but not tried. Lee and other generals were not punished. And if you'll remember, General Lee was one of those who didn't even want to go to war. He was just doing what he was told was his duty. Taxes raised funds to help rebuild the South, like we saw in our reading. That included building schools, houses, and hospitals, and then included also transportation. Remember, there was some disagreement on whether there should be a railroad between the South and the West and the North. At this point, these taxes are helped to actually put that railroad in place, as well as other roads. The South was divided into 5 zones and assigned generals to act as temporary government, and that was put in place under the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 68. Southern states were admitted back into the Union after they rewrote their state constitutions to include ratification of the 14th Amendment, which means the passing of the 14th Amendment, which gave rights to Black citizens. They are seen as citizens. And they also had to make an agreement that Black men could vote. So they would only be allowed back into the Union if they agreed upon those things. Okay, so at this point, I've kind of gone over the readings a little bit. And like I said, I've added a few other materials for you on there if you'd like to take a look at those. And I'll continue, like I said, as I get materials that come across my way to send those to you. So you have them. Go ahead and take a look at those questions that I sent. One thing I don't think I mentioned in the last video was you can either handwrite on those and I'll collect those when we get back to school, or if you want to do a Google Doc and type them, I know it's easier for some to type than it is to handwrite. Feel free to do that, and then you can share that document with me. And again, at 9 o'clock this evening, or by 9 o'clock this evening, I will try to get some answers to those questions, or how I might approach the answers to those questions. In this case, I will have those put up on Google Classroom for you guys, okay? Don't hesitate to email me or have parents text me or call me. And that's it. I guess the next class we have together would be biology today, and then English. I will see you guys later. Bye.